I'm down to answer a viewer question before we do that. Do I like the way that Devoker plays? Dev Evoker. I'll tell you this. I think hover and playing your spells while flying around like this is fun as hell. I think that is enough to make playing this spec feel like it's having a good time. There are a couple of caveats to that, right? The rotation in general, not very difficult, not very complex, not really a lot of decision making to be made in this tree. You're generally just going to play like the thing that sims the best 99% of the time, and like it's not going to affect your rotation very much. It just kind of is what it is. There's really, like, right now I'm only spec'd into 6 rotational buttons. I have my 2 filler spells, my 2 spender spells, and my 2 empowers. And when I'm fighting a single target boss, I push 4 buttons, right? I push Living Flame and Disintegrate, and then my 2 empower buttons, and that's pretty much it, right? So if you're used to a class that has a very complicated rotation, weaves in and out of different abilities, has a lot of different interactions, all those sorts of things, you're not really getting it here. Like, the coolest thing that Devastation Evoker basically does, I'll be honest with you, is you basically you cast Fire Breath, you can hit a whole bunch of targets with it, and then this Living Flame that you send out, right, hits all of these targets, but also will heal some targets that it doesn't hit, which also each one has an extra chance to proc Essence Burst, and also has a chance to heal, which procs the Scarlet Adaptation. This one thing where you cast Fire Breath into Living Flame, and it does like 4 different things, is maybe the single coolest set of interactions in the kit. And then the other thing that's just very, very fun and satisfying is when you cast Disintegrate, and every once in a while it throws out Eternity Surges. You saw the one where it just cleaved out 2 Eternity Surges. That's a very satisfying interaction. It's not like, there's not too much else to it. Basically, you have a couple of interactions here where it goes... when what's it called? You've got this one where those crits will give you Essence Burst. So this is going to scale with crit and give you a lot more Essence Burst. It's really nice. You can fish for crits using this. And then you have this one where the Eternity Surge is actually going to cleave onto 2 different targets. So Devastation is actually a bit of a cleave machine. Because your single target and your 2 target rotations are basically the same, but you just inherently cleave a lot of your single target stuff onto 2 targets. So you're going to have a really good time just naturally in a 2 target situation, just cleaving a bunch of extra Eternity Surges onto 2 targets and that sort of thing. Other than that, I'll be completely honest with you, the spec is basically just going to be executing a very, very simple rotation, but dealing with the fact that you're a 25-yard spec, and dealing with raid mechanics that hit you, even though you're a 25-yard spec, you probably still have to play them as if you're a normal range class. That's probably going to be the most complicated thing about playing this class. It's not going to be the rotation. It's not really going to be like, oh, hey, I have a whole bunch of weird talents to pick from, or any complicated, cooldown management or utility or anything like that. Like, a lot of the utility buttons are actually really straightforward. Like, I have a button, I fly to an ally and I heal them. Great. I can use that to heal them, or I can use that to just fly. Yeah, pretty much. No, I totally hear that. And here's the thing. So the one caveat, right, is when you're not flying around doing hover, your single target rotation looks like this. Cast Living Flame. Cast Disintegrate. 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 And you'll notice that both of those are casted buttons, right? So thank God you have 2 stacks of hover, you can get a 3rd with Time Spiral, and you have some other buttons that you can use in a pinch. But just be warned, right? that a lot of this rotation is quite literally just these 2 buttons, and they are hard casted abilities. So anyway, right? All of that said, right, you have some instant spells in Azure Strike here and Pyre, which you can use if you have to. Yeah, no. You know it. As a mage, you're used to it, pretty much, right? I hear you, dude. But yeah, that's about it, right? So overall, on the meter of how complex is the class, it's pretty low. How difficult is it going to be in Raid? That entirely comes down to how they design the encounters and if they're nice to Evoker or if they're mean to Evoker. If there's a lot of mechanics where they say, hey, go stack up with your ranged buddies at 40 yards away from the boss, you're going to be really sad. If there's mechanics where it goes, hey, you need to like go over there and then go do a dance for a bit and then come back, you're going to be sad because you're never going to hit the boss in that time. It's just going to be upsetting. If it's a mechanic where it's just like, hey, get away from the boss for a couple seconds and then come back, you can probably deal with that because you do have hover, you have abilities like fly with me or rescue to move around the battlefield, right? You have a couple instant cast spells. Like one really cool thing is that you have Emerald Blossom, which is the AoE hover, the AoE heal that the class has, but it's an instant cast, so you can just kind of drop it whenever and just drop this nice little heal on the group. It doesn't cost you anything. It's just an instant cast on a 30-second cooldown, right? So let's say you're doing stuff, you're like, ah, crap, I'm out of hover charges and I'm just trying to do some filler. I'm just gonna, I'm gonna pop a little heal now. So yeah, I'll answer those two and then go grab water and re-queue for sure. And then we can talk while we're in queue again. The AoE rotation, yeah, so two things, right? So I'll start with the second one just for fun. There's no real like anyone who's talking about red build or blue build is kind of not really like up to speed with how this class works, and or isn't really paying attention. Like they might just be talking about where they've like roughly spec'd in the tree. Like I'll pull up the tree and kind of show you why they might be talking about it in that way. These nodes are red on this side, right? These nodes are blue, right? But strictly speaking, in terms of like rotation and what you're pressing and when you're pressing it, it's not really, it doesn't really work that way. It's not like, my red spells are AoE and my blue spells are single target. It doesn't really work exactly like that. This side of the tree is generally speaking a little more oriented around AoE stuff around here. And this part of the tree, roughly speaking, is a little more focused on single target. But Eternity Span makes your Eternity Surge and Shattering Star hit twice as many targets. Charge Blast is something that actually buffs your Pyre, which is your AoE spender, right? That's this thing. This thing is Essence Burst stacking 2 times, which you use on everything. This node here, Continuum, where you get Eternity Surge crits, grant you Essence Burst. You're always going to take this no matter what. Like, no matter what build you're running, you're going to have this. Essence, you're never skipping Eternity Surge. You're always coming down the tree this way, right? So a lot of stuff right here, you're always going to take this now no matter what kind of thing. This is always just good stuff. That's good in single target. It's good in 2 target. And even some of the stuff, you're going to run it in, like, 8 target stuff, whatever. There's some interactions over here, though, right, that... And mainly it comes down to, like, Firestorm, basically. Like, some of this stuff plays in a little more to AoE, right? So Firestorm, in general, is this 20-second... I can just spec into it real quick, just to show you what that button looks like. But basically, Firestorm is your just AoE short cooldown. And it looks like this. So it's normally hard casted for 2 seconds. It drops this small circle on the ground that just kind of shoots bolts and hits stuff. It's not very strong. I want to like be super clear about that. It's not like a very powerful ability, but it does just sit there and hit stuff over 12 seconds. So, I mean, I'd like to see them maybe buff it. It has this cool proc here where you can actually reset its cooldown and get another instant cast one that does more damage, right? So this is kind of cool, and this interaction is relevant. But really, right now, what's happening is you don't have a crazy different build necessarily for single target versus AoE right now, for the most part. There are a couple things that you tweak. So like Eternity Span here, you don't need this on pure single target. This is just a wasted node on pure single target. But anytime you have 2 or more targets, it's good, right? But and then something like this, right? So like, hey, thanks for the follow, appreciate it. Something like this node here, Catalyze, where when channeling Disintegrate, Fire Breath on that target deals damage more often. That's a kind of button that's really only super useful in pure single target. You don't really need it as much in AoE, right? So certain little tweaks like that. There's a current sort of theory crafted build right now that basically says, hey, the single most important thing that you can do outside of spending your essence bursts is to extend your ever-burning flame as long as possible, or extend your fire breath as long as possible, right? So I'm spec'd into this thing called ever-burning flame. It says I'm going to extend my fire breath dot. And fire breath at rank 4, right, goes for 16 seconds. So what I can do is I can basically, you know, I'll send out this fire breath. It'll go for 16 seconds, right, on this target. And then when I hit it with a living flame, it goes back up to 12. If I hit it with a pyre, it goes up by 1 second. If I hit it with another pyre, it goes up by 1 second. That's sort of the idea of what's happening here. And, you know, I can kind of extend this a little bit longer just every time I hit it with a red spell, right? And I just kind of keep this going. You'll notice it hasn't dropped yet. It hasn't dropped yet. And I've actually maintained it for the full 30 seconds, right? So now I have 100% uptime on my fire breath. Now, the thing is that pyre is not a very good button on single target, and living flame is not necessarily something I want to be spamming on AoE, right? So there's a bit of a trade-off here, and the big kind of weird thing about the spec is that the single target filler is red, the AoE filler is blue, the single target cast ability is blue, and the or spender is blue, and the AoE spender is red. So there's a bit of a mismatch there, right? So when I'm talking about, hey, I want to extend my fire breath on a bunch of targets, or even just one target, I have to kind of use my red spells. Well, one is meant more for single target, one's meant more for AoE. It's a little bit weird, right? So Firestorm actually is a red ability that you can just put down, and just every time it hits, it also extends fire breath. So there's some theory crafting here about just using this kind of even in single target, just to kind of keep your fire breath going, right? So, and then mainly, like, you know, you would consider using it on AoE as well, just because it would be refreshing on all the targets. And then you can afford to fill with Azure Strike, let's say, right? So there are a lot of interactions right now that aren't, like, super finalized and or make the most sense. I would definitely encourage you, if you end up in beta and play around with it, to go post in the feedback thread about, like, what you like, what you don't like, what makes sense, what doesn't, kind of thing. But you can kind of tell from that, like, okay, I can kind of see why you might want to take this Firestorm thing if it's going to extend your dots and then give you a little more freedom around other buttons to push, because this thing, again, it starts with a base duration of 16 seconds, but then if I want to extend it back to 30, I'm going to need lots of hits. And then, so yeah, what do the procs mean for Pyre and Disintegrates? So the main thing of this spec is this Essence Burst thing. And it basically says when you push a filler spell, you have a chance to get an Essence Burst, making your next spender free. Caveat, you also will always take this node. This is a must-take node in the tree, and says whenever you use your Essence Burst, the damage of that ability is increased by 15%. Okay? And you're always going to take this node. Anyone not taking this node is trolling. These middle nodes here in the tree are basically must-take. And it's fine, because this is your major cooldown. This extends your major cooldown. This affects your Essence Burst, which is both part of your main kit and also part of your main cooldown, and then this makes your cooldown better. Like, there's no reason why you wouldn't just take this stuff. So the fact that this is in the middle here, it's fine. You're always going to go right down here. This says anytime you proc Essence Burst, the Essence Burst actually does more damage, right? So not only, right, I'm going to cast Living Flame. I have a 20% chance every time I do this to proc an Essence Burst. I procced an Essence Burst just there. This says your next Disintegrate or Pyre is free. It costs no essence. Here is my 6 essence. Here's the thing. I'm going to cast the Disintegrate right now, and I have done so. I haven't spent essence, and that Disintegrate also did 15% more damage than it would if I just cast it normally by spending essence. That's all very important, okay? So the fact is that because of this, right, the Might of the Aspects thing, spending essence bursts is much more important than spending essence. So spending your procs and not wasting your procs is much more important than spending your resource. Pretty much just because of this node. And it's quite literally that simple. And then finally, like, the main thing that your cooldown does, right? So your cooldown does 3 things. Your cooldown will throw pyres at 3 different enemies within 25 yards. And it doesn't mean it doesn't throw 3 pyres at 1 enemy. It's 1 pyre per enemy up to 3 enemies. It also makes it so you will always proc Essence Burst when you use a filler. And with Ruin, the Devastation Evoker Mastery is always active. at full value. So the big thing about the mastery is this thing basically says, hey, when your enemy has more health, they take more damage. It's like a reverse execute. Okay, so right now a target at full health is taking 32% more damage than if they were on no health. This is it's actually like pretty substantial how much we're talking here, because I'm only at like 850 rating. I think it's I want to say it's 220 or 230 points get me 2.5% on this. So 1,000 rating here is getting me about 12.5% of value. So it's not going to be too crazy. Like I have 2,300 crit right now, right? If I had that much in mastery, this thing would say 50%. Or pretty close anyway. And so later in the expansion, you're going to be dealing like easily 50-60% more damage to targets at max health than you are against targets with no health. This mastery is kind of wild, and it goes from 100 to 0, and there's no it's a linear function, and it's linear in both senses. It's linear in terms of that value, that 32%, and it's linear in that there's no fall off point, there's no minimum value of mastery that you're getting, and there's no like cutoff in terms of health. It's just full value at 100%, no value at 0%. So that's the other main thing that your main cooldown does, is says you're getting that 32% damage no matter what health your enemy is at. And that's very important for, you know, any boss in the game. Because you'll find that when you're in the execute phase of a boss and you're dealing 30% less damage than you were at the start of the fight, you're a little bit sad about that. That's not ideal. It's not a good time. And again, later in the expansion, it might be closer to 60%. You might be doing half as much damage at the end of the fight as you were at the start of the fight. Not great, right? So the caveat there is that if you're on a fight with a very important execute phase and you lust in execute, well, you're going to want to make sure that you have your Dragon Rage available for that. This thing, generally speaking, is going to last around 26 seconds. And so for that full 26 seconds, you get the full value of your mastery. And you're going to deal some decent damage during that window at the very least. So that means that, you know, you're going to get most of the value out of that lust at the very least. And this is entirely tuning dependent. There is a world where, and I'd be interested to kind of see some of the sims on this stuff at the very least. You can definitely build in such a way so as to extend Dragon Rage more, right? So Animosity basically says when you use an Empower spell inside Dragon Rage, you extend it by 6 seconds. So this thing's base 14 seconds. And then my 2 Empowers are base 30 seconds. So obviously, right off the bat, I'm only going to be able to cast 1 of each during my cooldown window. If I cast 1 of each, that brings me to 26 seconds. Well, I actually have a couple. I have one of each node to help me reduce the cooldown of my Empower spells. So I have one here that says Consuming Essence Burst reduces the cooldown of Fire Breath by 2 seconds. And I have one here that says Essence abilities reduce the remaining cooldown of Eternity Surge by 1 second. So it's actually possible to bring both of these down to be able to use 2 in one Dragon Rage, possibly even 3, maybe. And at that point, we're talking like a 32 or 38 second cooldown. That lines up a lot better with Lust. But you lose a lot of really important interactions by doing that. You lose the ability to extend your Flame Breath for a long time, and you lose this Eternity Surge crits give you Essence Burst, which is just really good. This is just a really cool effect. So that's sort of the caveat. The tree actually gives you the ability to extend Dragon Rage pretty long, and it will be pretty important on some of those execute-oriented fights to have a long Dragon Rage because of your mastery. But it totally just comes down to the tuning of the things in this tree to know if that makes sense or not, because the thing that this cooldown thing is competing with is very good, and same thing over here. The thing that this cooldown thing is competing with is very good. And I think I've seen a lot of people comment on these choice nodes not being particularly interesting because the like this one here, basically, obviously, if you look at it in a vacuum, it just says, hey, do I want to cast this more often or do I want to extend it, right? you know, and generally speaking, it turns out, hey, yeah, if I can, I just want to extend it, because being able to reduce its cooldown, all it does is really gives me another usage inside Dragon Rage and procs this Leaping Flames thing one more time, which makes the my Living Flame spread. Anyway, so what stats are going to be go-to for an Evoker? So here's the thing, right? Mastery is extremely strong. You get a lot of value from it for the points that you spend, right? So generally speaking, secondaries, in the most naive way, in the most very naive way to look at it, right? Before interactions, before anything, you can think of 1% of a secondary stack giving you, at the beginning, about 1% worth of damage. And this is very naive, again, right? A very naive way to look at it. But your first percent of crit is giving you about 1% damage. Your first percentage of versatility is giving you about 1% damage. Your first 1% haste is giving you about 1% damage. Then from there, you get diminishing returns on incremental secondaries. Never mind the breakpoints where there's fall off. But there are also interactions in the tree. So obviously I have this node here that makes my crits deal more critical damage. That changes how I scale with crit. I have this thing here that says crits grant me Essence Burst. That changes how I deal with crit. And then haste has different interactions too. So if I say, you know, hey, if I have an ability here that says I deal more damage for 4 seconds, well, the more spells I can fit inside 4 seconds, the more damage I'm going to do. So haste actually has, in theory, interactions with stuff like this, but only at a certain breakpoint, only if I'm actually able to fit another spell in that window. And so I haven't seen that haste necessarily has any obvious breakpoints yet. It's very early for Sims and that kind of stuff, but haste obviously does stuff for Evoker. It makes your Empower spells cast a little bit faster. I'd like to see them cast even faster than they are right now. It kind of feels a little slow, but that's one thing that they do that's very good. And then obviously, you know, stuff like your dots tick faster, etc. All that stuff is very nice with haste. And haste always just makes you, it makes you as a caster feel better, because you're casting your stuff more frequently, you're getting procs more frequently, you're casting your spells faster, which means you can dodge things more easily. Haste is always fun. Crit, I showed a couple interactions in the tree. Crit is good. And then where I was going with it, though, was that mastery is actually it's very highly budgeted is the thing. So in the way that 1% haste might be about 1% damage on average to start, 1% crit might be about 1% on average to start. Mastery, again, that rating is giving you 2.5% damage to enemies based on their health. Well, on average, right, for an enemy at 50% health, that's giving me an extra 1.25% damage. So right off the bat, mastery on average is much better than my other secondaries. The problem is that I don't necessarily value damage evenly throughout the course of a fight. And that's why, in a sense, in my mind, it's slightly overtuned. Is because if I'm going to deal more damage at the start of a fight, I'd better deal a lot of damage to compensate for that. Because generally speaking, execute is a more favorable sort of thing, right? So if you were to look at a sim right now, kind of thing, with a Bloodlust on the pull, generally speaking, this class will have a good combination of mastery, crit, and haste. It'll probably want a good amount of mastery to start, quite a bit. And the fact of the matter is it gets a lot of value from that mastery with that Bloodlust on the pull. And then assuming that you have good use of your cooldowns throughout the fight, especially if, you know, you get a good Dragon Rage sort of right before the boss dies and that kind of thing, then you can at least maximize the value of your mastery over the course of a fight, assuming you know roughly how long it's going to last. So the way I see it, it's probably, like, in terms of sim value, like a 5-minute Bloodlust on pull sim, mastery should be your very top stat. Crit looks pretty good, though, and haste looks pretty good, though. And I'd probably say it's roughly in that order, but where you're going to want a good mix and not, strictly speaking, like only stacking one stat or only stacking 2 stats. And the thing is even like here, this node here, Tyranny, improves the more crit you have, right? Something like this is better the more crit you have, kind of thing, right? So you have some effects in here that actually scale nicely as the expansion goes on. You have a couple, which is nice. Same thing when you have stuff like crits give you more essence bursts, and essence bursts are sort of your I don't spend any resource and I do more damage. That stuff's really nice too. That stuff scales nicely into later parts of the expansion. So that's my rough read. And the rough problem with that is that if you technically overinvest in mastery, you could get a little bit burned on some of these fights where you need a powerful execute phase. Because, right, in very like basic terms, here actually let me show you, because I actually have a little bit of a visualization handy. Let me see. It would be this one. So I quickly plotted. I was looking at my Warcraft logs, and I basically looked up how much damage my Living Flame was doing and plotted it on a chart over boss health, right? And you can actually see it, like, you can see it start by dealing around 14,000 damage, and by the end of the fight, it's doing about 11,000 damage, right? So, strictly speaking, you can see that thing go down in value over the course of a fight. The more mastery you play, the steeper this line is going to be, right? You're going to deal a lot more damage at the start of a fight and a lot less damage by the end of the fight. The slope of this line, this 28%, is basically how much mastery I was running at the time, right? So, turns out, hey, again, 1 point of this is really strong compared to 1 point of crit or 1 point of haste. But, and the thing is of course, like, as you know from playing other classes, you're going to want a nice balance. You're going to want at least a little bit of each other stat, to start. But you might find that stacking too much mastery gives you an undesirable damage curve where you're not dealing as much damage towards the end of a fight that you'd like. And so it might turn out that people, some people might get away with speccing more mastery than others. You might find, hey, I can afford to play more mastery because my guild is just zooted and doesn't need me for the last phase DPS check. So I can just play mastery, get away with it, and be okay. And it's not even, like, just to be clear, it's not even necessarily that you're doing no damage towards the end of the fight, and you do have the benefit of your Dragon Rage, which you can use during Bloodlust, that'll give you that full value. And of course, during that duration, with Bloodlust, you're getting a ton of extra value from the mastery while you do have it. But if your end of boss burn phase is, like, 2 minutes long, it's really hard to make up for that with just your, like, 30-second cooldown window, right? So, bottom line, I'm pretty sure, like, in my head and based on some preliminary sims, it's something like good combination of mastery, crit, and haste, but probably slightly in that order for preference. But the way that the mastery works, it might turn out that you don't necessarily want to stack it as much. And if that's the case, then you might want a little more crit, you might want a little more haste. Mastery, though, it's tuned well enough to encourage you to use it, is the thing. So, hard to say for sure, right? But that's kind of where it is right now. So I hope that makes sense from a PvE standpoint anyway. PvP, I'm clueless, but the thing is that I imagine, I imagine that mastery is just good, because, like, you're just dealing damage to shit, like, from full health very often. But then also versatility actually matters in PvP, and haste is going to matter a lot in PvP, because you're sitting there, like, sleeping as you try and cast an empower spell. Like, anyway. Yeah, no, dude, I hope that helps. Oh, dude, my mouth is so parched. Yeah, I'm definitely going to do that. Thanks.